In this episode, Lex Fridman sits down Mark Dubowitz and Scott Horton for a debate on the Iran-Israel conflict. They explore the origins of recent escalations, Iran's nuclear program, the legacy of the JCPOA, military strikes like Operation Midnight Hammer, and the role of U.S. foreign policy. The discussion contrasts Dubowitz's advocacy for peace through strength and maximum pressure with Horton's libertarian call for non-intervention, diplomacy, and a sober reckoning with the costs of war. The podcast opens with a detailed exploration of the recent escalation between Iran and Israel, tracing the roots of the conflict back to the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign. Dubowitz outlines how President Trump, upon taking office, made it clear that Iran would not be allowed to develop nuclear weapons, initiating a series of diplomatic rounds in Oman aimed at curtailing Iran's nuclear program. Despite multiple negotiation attempts, Iran rejected the U.S. offer, which included temporary above-ground enrichment and a consortium with Gulf states under IAEA supervision. This rejection led to a military campaign, including Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear sites and the U.S. dropping massive bunker-buster bombs on the Fordo enrichment facility. Horton counters this narrative by framing the maximum pressure campaign in negotiations as a pretext for war, arguing that the U.S. and Israel never expected Iran to give up enrichment, which is seen by Tehran as a latent nuclear deterrent. He emphasizes that Iran's posture has been defensive, warning against attacks by maintaining a latent capability rather than actively pursuing a nuclear weapon. Horton highlights the cyclical nature of provocations and responses, suggesting that military strikes and assassinations by Israel have only pushed Iran to increase its enrichment levels as a bargaining chip, rather than a genuine breakout toward a bomb. A significant portion of the debate centers on the technical and political status of Iran's nuclear program. Dubowitz presents a detailed account of Iran's nuclear history, emphasizing that Iran has had an active nuclear weapons program, known as the Ahmad program, which was halted in 2003, but left behind dispersed scientists and capabilities. He stresses that Iran's nuclear facilities, including Natanz and Fordo, were built secretly and buried underground to protect them from attack, and that Iran has accumulated enriched uranium up to 60%, which is 99% of the way to weapons-grade uranium. Horton challenges these assertions, arguing that much of the evidence for an active weapons program has been fabricated or exaggerated, citing the role of Israeli intelligence and the Mujahideen-e-Khalq in spreading disinformation. He points out that Iran has abided by the JCPOA's restrictions for years, shipping out enriched uranium and limiting enrichment levels, and that the jump to 60% enrichment was a reaction to Israeli sabotage and assassination campaigns. Horton also explains the technical difficulties Iran would face in weaponizing uranium, especially in miniaturizing warheads for missile delivery, and notes that the simplest uranium bomb design, gun type, is not deliverable by missile, limiting its military utility. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, is a focal point of disagreement. Dubowitz defends the JCPOA as a flawed but significant diplomatic achievement that temporarily limited Iran's nuclear capabilities, including restrictions on enrichment levels, centrifuge development, and stockpiles, while providing sanctions relief. He highlights the sunset clauses that would allow Iran to expand its nuclear program after 2025 and 2031, which he views as a fatal flaw. Dubowitz laments the Trump administration's withdrawal from the deal, but acknowledges the difficulty in renegotiating with a divided Europe and an intransigent Iran. Horton critiques the JCPOA as a deal that never truly stopped Iran's nuclear ambitions, arguing that the U.S. withdrawal was justified given Iran's continued enrichment and covert activities. He also points to the political dynamics that prevented Trump from engaging in direct diplomacy with Iran, including the Russia investigation and European resistance to renegotiation. Horton stresses that the JCPOA's enforcement mechanisms were weak and that the deal was more about managing Iran's nuclear program than eliminating it, which he sees as a pragmatic but ultimately insufficient approach. The podcast delves into the recent U.S. and Israeli military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer. Dubowitz argues that the strikes, including the use of B-2 bombers dropping massive bunker buster bombs on Fordo, significantly degraded Iran's nuclear infrastructure and sent a clear message of deterrence. He views the operation as a demonstration of peace through strength, designed to force Iran back to the negotiating table and prevent nuclear breakout. Horton offers a more cautious assessment, warning that such strikes risk escalating the conflict and may actually incentivize Iran to accelerate its nuclear program as a defensive measure. He highlights Iran's ability to rebuild and deepen its facilities underground, suggesting that military action alone cannot solve the problem. Horton also points out that Iran's missile strikes in response have been largely symbolic, aimed at signaling resolve without provoking full-scale war, and that the U.S. has shown restraint in avoiding casualties. The discussion broadens to Iran's role in the Middle East, particularly its support for proxy groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and Shiite militias in Iraq and Yemen. Dubowitz emphasizes Iran's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism and its long history of attacks against U.S. and Israeli interests, including assassinations and missile attacks. He argues that Iran's regional ambitions and support for terrorism make it a unique threat that justifies strong U.S. and Israeli responses. Horton challenges the narrative that Iran is the primary aggressor, pointing to the complex history of U.S. and Israeli interventions in the region, including support for groups that later turned hostile. He highlights the role of Israeli policies in fueling resentment and violence, and disputes claims that Iran directly orchestrated attacks such as the 1983 Beirut Marine Barracks bombing or the 2003 Iraq insurgency. Horton frames Iran's actions as largely reactive to external aggression and stresses the need to understand the broader geopolitical context. The guests debate the influence of the U.S. Israel relationship on American foreign policy. Dubowitz defends the strong alliance, arguing that Israel is a vital partner in counterterrorism and regional stability, and that U.S. policy is driven by shared interests rather than undue influence. He acknowledges the presence of pro-Israel lobbying, but frames it as part of a democratic process reflecting broad support. Horton is more critical, suggesting that the Israel lobby has disproportionately shaped U.S. policy toward perpetual conflict in the Middle East. He accuses some policymakers of prioritizing Israeli interests over American ones and warns of the dangers of conflating U.S. and Israeli security. Horton also highlights historical instances where Israeli intelligence withheld information from the U.S. and where U.S. policy was influenced by misleading narratives about Iran and Iraq. The possibility of regime change in Iran is discussed with caution. Dubowitz warns that a sudden collapse of the Iranian regime could lead to chaos, civil war, and the proliferation of nuclear and missile technology among competing factions, potentially requiring U.S. military intervention to secure dangerous materials. He advocates for a strategy of maximum pressure combined with support for Iranian dissidents and a negotiated transition. Horton strongly opposes regime change, citing the disastrous outcomes of U.S. interventions in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. He argues that attempts to forcibly remove regimes have led to prolonged instability, civil war, and the rise of extremist groups. Horton stresses the importance of diplomacy, restraint, and respect for Iranian sovereignty, warning that military escalation risks catastrophic consequences for the region and beyond. The debate expands to the broader implications of Iran's nuclear ambitions on global proliferation. Dubowitz expresses concern that if Iran acquires nuclear weapons or retains enrichment capabilities, it will trigger a cascade of nuclear programs in the Middle East and Asia, including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. He argues that maintaining credible deterrence and enforcing non-proliferation norms is essential to prevent a wider arms race. Horton counters that military strikes and aggressive policies may accelerate proliferation by convincing other states that nuclear weapons are necessary for survival. He points to North Korea as an example where U.S. hostility pushed the regime to develop nuclear arms. Horton advocates for renewed arms control efforts, diplomatic engagement, and a reduction in global nuclear arsenals as the best path to long-term security. Dubowitz champions the concept of peace through strength, asserting that credible U.S. military power and the willingness to use it selectively are key to deterring adversaries and preventing war. He praises President Trump's approach of targeted strikes combined with diplomatic offers, arguing that this balance maintains leverage without full-scale conflict. Dubowitz stresses the importance of alliances and forward deployment to uphold the rules-based international order. Horton acknowledges the necessity of deterrence, but warns against over-reliance on military solutions, which can entangle the U.S. in endless conflicts. He advocates for a restrained military posture focused on defense rather than intervention, emphasizing the costs of war and the risks of escalation. Horton calls for a foreign policy grounded in non-aggression, diplomacy, and respect for sovereignty, consistent with libertarian principles. The guests reflect on historical parallels and lessons, particularly from the 1930s and World War II. Dubowitz draws a parallel between Hitler's miscalculation of American isolationism and Iran's misjudgment of U.S. resolve, suggesting that early and credible deterrence can prevent catastrophic wars. He warns against appeasement and stresses the need to confront threats before they become unmanageable. Horton cautions against overlearning historical lessons to justify perpetual militarism, arguing that many U.S. interventions have been based on flawed assumptions and have caused more harm than good. He highlights the dangers of demonizing adversaries and the importance of nuanced understanding. Horton envisions a future where diplomacy and peace conferences replace endless wars, and where the U.S. leads by example in reducing nuclear arsenals and fostering global stability. Horton articulates a libertarian vision of U.S. foreign policy centered on non-interventionism, limited government, and the non-aggression principle. He advocates for drastically reducing military commitments abroad, focusing on defense rather than empire building, and promoting peace through diplomacy rather than force. Horton emphasizes the importance of respecting other nations' sovereignty and avoiding entangling alliances. Dubowitz acknowledges the appeal of libertarian ideals, but argues that America's global leadership role requires maintaining a strong military and engaging actively in international affairs. He stresses the need for a balanced approach that combines strength with diplomacy and recognizes the realities of a dangerous world. Dubowitz supports pragmatic policies that protect U.S. interests while seeking peaceful resolutions where possible. The conversation concludes with reflections on hope for the future and the profound costs of war. Both guests express admiration for the resilience and wisdom of the American people and the potential for peace through thoughtful leadership. They acknowledge the tragic human and economic toll of militarism and emphasize the need for careful, judicious use of power. Fridman closes the episode with sobering words from Dwight D. Eisenhower, highlighting the immense sacrifices and resources consumed by war and warning against the unchecked influence of the military-industrial complex.